Good to see everybody here this morning. Good morning. Great day to have a school blessing, to have bless our students and our teachers as they prepare to begin a new year. I know Aiden has already started his school year. Maybe some of you teachers that are here, I know you've already started your school year. And school administrators have already been working all summer long. So they never stop working. So we're going to have a special time of blessing at the conclusion of our service today. I'll tell you, Lee, that I come up here and I'm all ready to go, and then we sing a song like that, and I'm suddenly all in pieces. So you just have to give me a minute while I put myself back together. What a beautiful song it is. Good to see Harold and Carolyn with us this morning. And we've had several families that we've seen that have been, they're not new to us, they're not guests at all, but we're so glad that they're back with us, and we're delighted. We're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 5 today. There exists, let's just jump right into it. There exists a direct correlation between the effectiveness of our mission as the church and how we treat each other here. There is a direct correlation. Let me repeat that. I didn't do the usual introductory illustration that makes you laugh. I want to start because this is heavy. Nehemiah 5 is heavy. There is a direct correlation between how well we do our mission as the church with how we treat each other. We must be the church before we can build the church. We must care for each other before we can hope to reach anybody with the gospel. No one is going to believe our witness if our witness isn't consistent with the one we are witnessing about. The text in Nehemiah 5 is all about the witness of God's people and how they couldn't finish the wall until they got the love right. The wall is nearly done. It's taken years to get the Jerusalem wall completed. They're almost there. And you see through Ezra, as Jared has been going through, we go through Ezra and we see the law beginning to take its rightful place among the people of God, and you have the building of the altar. The first thing built in the midst of a town that is really more like a slum than it is a city. A once holy, glorious city that was so known as the city of the great king. And here it is. It's just mostly rubble and a few houses here and there. And it's taken a lot to get to where they are. But they started with this altar, and they built this stone altar, and the first thing they did was start to shed the blood of animals and to burn sacrifices so that God could atone for the sins of the people. And they did this without the benefit of a wall. And they did this without the benefit of the entire temple. The temple would be next. And there they are, naked in the prairie with no wall around them, with this altar burning and a hole in the ground that they had dug out with Iron Age style shovels. That's basically where we're at. And all of that labor, that's not the half of it. Not only was the labor excruciatingly difficult and slow, but they were opposed at every turn by enemies who should have had nothing whatsoever to do with what they were doing. Guys like Sanballat and Tobiah. We don't know anything about these guys except that they hated Jews. That's all. They just didn't like what they were doing. And so when the foundation was about to be completed, or was complete, Sanballat and Tobiah kicked into high gear and started opposing at every turn what they were doing, what Jews were doing. In fact, so much so that they managed to persuade the king to stop the construction of the temple. And it wasn't for some years after that they finally got the temple done. And then it was on to the wall. And they worked and they worked and they worked. For over 12 years, they worked to try to get this wall built. It was massive in its size. But they still had enemies to fight. And so as they went up on the wall to build, they would carry up their bricks and mortar and whatever else one hand could hold, and then they would carry a spear in the other so they could fight off the enemy. That's how they built the wall. And people evidently quit their jobs or decided that their jobs that were providing food and money for their households were just now a side hustle, that Nehemiah had so impressed on them the importance of building this wall that they had absolutely spent all of their money till there was nothing left for them to give. And so a problem arose, and Nehemiah chapter 5, here's where we are. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." So a drought had occurred during this time, right? Verse 4. Still others were saying, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and our daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. Now, you don't have to be an attorney or a banker to know what's going on here. We're not told specifically until this point, as they had been building this wall, that there was a rot, a growing resentment among the people of Israel, of Judah. And while the wall was being built by dedicated, faithful people who loved God and respected, even awed guys like Nehemiah, the people were being swallowed up by debt and need. There is no evidence whatsoever that those who were working on the wall in Jerusalem ever got a nickel for the work they did. There's no evidence. The wall was a side hustle, but it was a freebie. And it became the passion of the people to get this wall built. So people were losing money as they took on this responsibility of building the wall. So great was their devotion, but it was wearing away at the foundation of their relationships because there were some people who were taking advantage of this situation for their own financial enrichment. Crops were not getting raised, or they were getting raised so small that they couldn't afford to make the mortgage payments on their land, and so they would lose their land. The wall was not a side hustle, it was their passion. And Nehemiah had emphasized nothing was more important, so all these other matters like paying your bills took second place. So great was the devotion of Israel, of Judah, to the construction of this wall. But the marketplace where the food and the goods were bought and sold were filled with people who were up into their necks in debt because they hadn't been able to pay their bills. This is a time when debt was paid for in several different ways. For those of us in 2022 with modern bankruptcy laws, which kind of incorporate it is a form of mercy into our banking and into our financial culture. In the United States and in many other places, bankruptcy is an act of mercy. It's humiliating, yes, but it is an act of mercy where you can actually begin again. You couldn't do that in these days. No. You had several things that you could do before, you sold yourself. You see, if you started to lose money, the only thing you could do was to sell what you owned. And if you sold what you owned, then you mortgaged property or borrowed money against your property. And apparently, reading this, they were losing their property. They were losing their shirts because they couldn't pay the debt. And so the people who were rich bought up the land, were able to loan money to their Jewish brothers and sisters, and they bought up the land to the point where people were not even laboring in their own fields anymore. And they weren't getting paid very well. Plus, they had a tax to pay. And then you had to sell your children into slavery. Unthinkable. And yet that was one of very few viable options that they had at this time. And then you would sell yourself into slavery. In the face of this report, here's what Nehemiah said in chapter 5, verse 6. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you're charging your own people interest. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles, and now you were sold, and now you're selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us. They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. The wealthy had become wealthier. The middle class was no more. They were dirt poor now, with nothing to their names except the clothes on their backs and their ability to work as slaves. And you know, there's no miracles in Ezra and Nehemiah, for no fire from heaven, nothing like that. Although I would consider it a miracle that no other nations attacked Jerusalem while they were without walls. That's a small miracle. But it was a big miracle when rich politicians didn't know what to say to Nehemiah. Did you notice that? In verse 8, he said, they kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. That's just how bad this was. Verse 9, so I continued. Nehemiah's not done. What you're doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending to people money and grain, but let us stop charging interest. Notice he used the word us. He included himself in this. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you're charging them. 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. I read that passage and I thought, boy, for those were the good old days. A 1% tax. Our city sales taxes are at least that much. That doesn't include everything else that we get taxed on. A couple of things really hit me hard here. Their immediate repentance. Note, we will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. And then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe, and I said, in this way may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied. And at this, the whole assembly said, Amen. And they praised the Lord, and the people did as they had promised. That hits me. That's like Pentecost. What do we do? And then 3,000 people baptized that day. Here it says, Nehemiah tells them what to do. You need to give back the land that you've taken, that you have foreclosed on. I say, well, that's legal. Legal doesn't make it right. And so Nehemiah said, stop charging interest. He included himself in that. He said, let us stop charging interest. What a change. And when it was over, they didn't moan about their lighter pocketbooks. They praised God and said amen. It was such a relief for them. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, so the song says. He was, what would you say, altitudinally challenged? Is that the correct word for it? He was really, really diminutive. I don't want to use the S word, the short word. He was diminutive. He was a short guy. He couldn't see Jesus. Jesus was coming along, and Zacchaeus had heard about this great rabbi, and so he climbed up into a tree to see Jesus. And of course, you remember what happened. Jesus saw him up in the tree, and he said, "I'm having lunch at your house today." He invited himself over for lunch. Jesus did. And so Zacchaeus got down from the tree just excited about having Jesus at his house. And so Zacchaeus and all of his friends were there. Tax collectors. The richest guys in all of Judah. These guys were the richest, most hated men in all of Judah. Zacchaeus was one of them. And he said, after being with Jesus for a lunchtime, in Luke 19, verse 8, it says, Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now." I like that. Here and now. Not next week. I'm not going to the bank. I'm here and now. I give half of my possessions to the poor. Whoa. That's all of his possessions. Half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. That's, for those of us who are mathematically challenged, that is a 400% penalty interest penalty. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham." These Jews told Nehemiah something similar. He said, "We'll collect no more debts." Get this. "We'll collect no more debts. We'll collect no more interest." They stopped the indebtedness that day. They stopped the interest charges that day. And then they gave them back all the stuff they had foreclosed. They agreed to this. They praised the Lord. The community council meeting was concluded, and Nehemiah did something extraordinary after this. He told them that the empire, which had been paying him for his work as governor of Jerusalem, he said later in the chapter, we're going to touch on it in just a moment, but he said, I had the right to charge more taxes than I did. But instead, to feed the people at my table, and there was all of his cabinet, all of his family and his cabinet, all of his advisors, they would sit at his table. He says, I've taken that, by the way, out of my own pocket to spend. I have paid for that myself. I have not taxed people. And his reason was, he says, because the burden was already heavy on people. Man. Nehemiah was quite a guy. A further reminder of what a good leader does for his people. He'd already set the example of a generous governor, but he would not now burden his people with any more taxes for the people that ate at his table, although he said he was entitled to it legally. There's 3 things I want you to notice about Nehemiah. Think about this as not just as a character study of Nehemiah, but think about this as how do we treat each other here? And how do we treat others on the outside? But start here. Because this is where we begin everything. In our families. Our family at home and our family here. This is where we start every good thing. Is here. Number 1, integrity. Integrity. I love the word integrity because it comes from another English word, integer, which means a whole number. How many math teachers have we got? Is Aaron McCain here? There's a math teacher. Is Aaron McCain here? No? But Tom, you know about integers, right? Okay. An integer can be the number 3, 7, 1,400,000, that's an integer, okay? It's a whole number. You can't have 1.5, that's a fraction. That's not an integer, that's not a whole number. And integrity means that you are a whole person. You're not divided up, you're not fractionalized. You haven't fractioned up your life into, that's my church life, that's my secular life, that's my family life, this is my job life, this is my business life. You see, if you are a person of integrity, you're all the same. You are a whole. You are the same person at your business, the same person at your school, the same person at church, the same person in your family. You are a whole person, the same person everywhere you go. And that people notice people like that. They also notice people of integrity treat people, whether they're rich or poor, famous or unknown, important or not by the world's standards, the same way. People of integrity are whole people. They don't fractionalize up people. They don't divide up their lives. They live one whole existence, a holy existence. That's integrity, because integrity touches every part of your life. In business, are you honest? Are you compassionate in your business? But business is business, isn't it? That was the problem with rich Jews and political officials in Jerusalem, and with a great many people today. They thought it was all right to exploit people because it was legal to do it. Business is just business, they would say. That's not integrity. Business is you, and business is me. That's who we are. If I am unfair and unforgiving, and I have no compassion or empathy or care for other people in my business, then I could rightfully be called an uncaring, uncompassionate, and unempathetic person. You can't just say, that's business. No, God doesn't see us like that. He sees you today and tomorrow the same way. We're all nice and well behaved here, right? He looks at you Monday the same way. He'll see you Monday. He'll see you Tuesday. He'll see if you're honest and if you're compassionate, if you care about your coworkers. He sees. Because business is really just who we are. Nehemiah was stricken with guilt and remorse and anger for the way they had done business in Jerusalem, and he took some of that responsibility on himself. He said, we got to stop doing this. Let us stop charging interest. We have to do that. You look at James, the 2nd chapter. James, if there was ever a more right down to earth guy, it was James. So, when church leaders or leaders of any kind, wherever they are, Bible class teachers, elders, or teachers in school, deacons, business people, managers, from high level to low level, or just plain old employees in the factory, the way you treat the poor is how God sees you, not how you treat the rich. How you treat the important is not nearly as important as how you treat the unimportant. James said it this way in chapter 2. He said, brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, we must not show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, sit on the floor by my feet, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Being people of integrity means we don't judge people by the way they look or how much money is in their bank account. We don't judge people on the basis of what we see on the outside. To be people of integrity, we see people as God sees them. created in his image and loved by him. James calls those who treat the well-to-do with honor and the poor judges with evil thoughts. Well, that's a little harsh, isn't it? I mean, we're just, that's the way you do. No, he says, you're judges. You're deciding a person is not worth as much because they don't have as much money or as much influence or power. To be people of integrity, we love all people. We see people as God sees them, and we don't divide up our lives into sections and say there are different rules of behavior. Nehemiah, he was the ultimate in integrity. What you're doing in business, what you're doing in government, what you do every day is who you are. Nehemiah believed that. And he said, brothers and sisters, we got to stop living this way. We have to start living as the people of God. Reverence him. Second thing we need to note about him is to have compassion. Nehemiah got angry because the poor were being mistreated. Now, I know this is probably, I'm going to make this statement. I want you to just think about it just a minute. Don't take this out of its context, but think about this for a moment. When do we lose our cool? I mean, when do we get angry? Well, I get angry sometimes when I don't get my way. We get angry when things don't work like they should. We get angry at politicians for raising taxes. We get angry with our neighbor for the way they don't mow their yard. We get angry about a lot of things. We steam up about a lot of things. Jesus Christ, when he got steamed? When the poor were being taken advantage of. He got really mad about that. The week of his crucifixion, he went into the temple where they were selling the sacrificial animals that the poor would offer, and he saw the money changers ripping people off, charging premiums for the money they were exchanging, Roman money for temple money, how they were stealing from people and then stealing by overpricing the sacrifices. Jesus went in there with a whip of cords and he turned over their tables and he whipped those animals out of there. What do you get angry about? What do I get angry about? Do I get angry about the injustices done to the poor? That is not some liberal talking point. That's us. Do we care? Jesus sure did. Nehemiah cared. It was important. Do we know the kinds of things that the poor have to go through just to make it in a day, to pay their bills? When we're buying gas at the gas station, I'm thinking about me. I think, wow, I sure am paying a lot for gas. But I really ought to think, I wonder what the poor guy on the poor section of town is having to do now. What's he doing? How's he making it? Okay, so I'm cutting into my savings. He's cutting into his living. Do we care? And are we going to do anything to help? The third thing that I notice about Nehemiah, and a third thing for good family life, to build the church, we got to be the church, and that's humility. One last thing Nehemiah modeled for the nobility and the political leaders of Jerusalem was humility. Do you know he took personal responsibility for all the people that were exploited? He took responsibility. Yeah, he talked to the noblemen, and he talked to the politicians, the political officials, about what they were doing and how they were unjust and how they were taxing people and how they shouldn't do that. And then he said, but we don't need to be charging interest. He took it upon himself to do something. When he heard the cries of those who were suffering, he immediately took upon himself to alleviate the suffering. He called upon those on whom had fallen the mantle of leadership, that group of people he talked with, to personally step up and do something about what was happening to these poor people. That's humility. You take responsibility and you immediately do something. You don't wait for the government to start a program. You don't wait for the church to start a program. You don't wait for your community and some NGO to do what we need to be doing. Helping people. But Paul, that's not realistic. I mean, we live in a complicated world. We have businesses to run and work for. It's not easy to make things as right as they should be. But Nehemiah, if he taught us anything, he said, you can do something. Something, anything to help. That matters. For Nehemiah, he used all the influence he had to bring about fairness in a terrible situation. It may not completely fix a problem in your family or at your work, taking responsibility, doing what you're able to do. It may not fix a problem with your friends or in the church. But answers to these things always start with us personally. With me and with you. And we must humble ourselves before a mighty God who sees us exactly as we are. And do something when we see someone who's suffering. Nehemiah modeled this, I think, in a beautiful way in Nehemiah 5:17. And that will finish our textual reading for this morning. He said, furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day, 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me. And every 10 days, an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. And in spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor because the demands were heavy on these people. The very next verse, he says, please remember me, Lord. Everything that Nehemiah did was based on 2 things. If the church is going to be the church, we need to base everything on 2 things. Love God and love others. I've said this before, it's not complicated, but it sure is comprehensive. He was completely committed to his commission to build that wall, but he would not use the urgency of the commission to dilute his compassion for his people. We would do well to remember that as we build the church, that we will do so not on the backs of our people, but we'll build the church by building up our people. We do well to remember that in whatever our enterprise in life is. I appreciate something that Susan said the other day, Susan Mackey. Susan Mackey is, Susan, are you here? I'm going to embarrass you. I'm sorry. I can't help it. I can't help it. It's something that you said last week. Susan is an administrator with one of our big school districts here. And we were talking after services. A bunch of teachers were standing around, and they were talking about, and Susan was, of course, telling, I'd asked her, I said, Susan, you hadn't had a summer off, have you? Nope, she'd been at work the whole time. Well, the rest of the teachers are getting ready to go back and have been back this past week and getting ready to start. And here's someone who wields tremendous authority. She probably doesn't think about it that way, but she wields tremendous influence and authority in her responsibility. She's into a very high position of curriculum management in the elementary school, in the elementary schools. And I said, we were talking along, and I said, and here's the boss right here. And I was pointing at Susan. Susan said, no, I'm just the suggester. I thought, in that moment, I got it. It's not about who's in charge. It's about the one who cares about what other people think, who cares that other people grow. I'd like to work for Susan Mackey someday. I'm a little old. But I like listening to people who want folks to grow, and she's willing to help them. Nehemiah did that. He did not lord it over people, but he certainly helped them grow. In his book, Soul Talk, Larry Crabb wrote this. He says, which is worse, A church program to build community that doesn't get off the ground? Or one person sitting every Sunday in the back of the church who remains unknown? A Sunday school class that once drew hundreds but has now dwindled to 30, or a Sunday school teacher whose sense of failure is never explored by a caring friend? A family torn apart by the father's drinking, his wife's frustration, and their third graders' learning disabilities? Or a self-hating dad, a terrified mom, and a lonely little boy, three human beings whose beauty and value no one ever discovers? A national campaign that fails to gain steam for the pro-life movement, or a single woman on her way home from an abortion clinic in the backseat of a taxi, a woman whose soul no one ever touches? We may notice the unknown pew sitter. We wonder how the teacher of the now small class feels. We worry over each member of the torn-up family. And we feel for the guilt and pain of a woman who has ended her baby's life. But we do what's easier. We design programs. We brainstorm ways to build attendance. And in our outrage over divorce statistics and abortion numbers, we fight for family values. These are all good things, but we don't talk to the pew sitter. We don't ask the teacher how he's feeling, and we don't invite the dad to play. We try to save the world, but we don't help our neighbor. There's something all of us can do here and now today to help someone. And then, when we take that personally, that responsibility, no matter how big or small the work may seem to be, we'll begin building this church. If you need to come this morning, whatever your need is, we want you to come. This message has been designed to convict us. And it already, if you're wondering about stepping on toes, I already stepped on my own before I preached it. So I point a finger and there's four pointing back at me. I promise you, I am unworthy to bring this message, but it's a message that Nehemiah brings us, and we need to be faithful to it. If you need to come, whatever your reason, if you want to start a walk with Jesus, we want to help you. We want you to be serious about your walk. This isn't just church time stuff. This isn't about joining a church or being a member of the Southside Church of Christ. This is about dedicating your life in its entirety, all of yourself, to Jesus Christ and following him. And he waits for you if you have not done that. As we stand and as we sing, if you need to, come.